Order and a very warm welcome to this one-off inquiry session into carers' benefits beyond the Sayce review. And it's a pleasure to welcome Liz Sayce, who was the independent reviewer of the overpayments of carers' allowance report. And I'm very grateful to welcome you, Liz, as I say. I don't know if there are any you'd like to make any opening remarks before we kick off with some questions.
Thank you so much for inviting me to come today, and I'm pleased that you're looking at this issue, because I think it was very positive that the government accepted many of my recommendations, but I think it's really important that they're tracked. And I noticed that the department has recently said that they're committing to reporting every 6 months on the progress they're making against those recommendations to yourselves and the Public Accounts Committee. So it will be public knowledge and available for everybody to see how far they've got, the pace, because I think some of the issues, there's ambiguity on what exactly it means that they've agreed to a recommendation, and in some cases they've put the timescale into the longer term. So I think it's going to be really important that there's that ongoing scrutiny and tracking. So maybe that's all I want to say to begin with. It's perhaps also just useful to remind you that I no longer have a formal role. So I'm talking primarily from having done the review and just kind of how I see the picture now.
Absolutely, and it's in that context that we'd like to ask you some questions, if that's okay. And thank you for clarifying that and what we should be aware of as well. So I just wondered if you could sort of characterise from your knowledge, from your experience, given that we have this committee in its different iterations has shown considerable concern about carers' allowance and the overpayments of carers' allowance going back to 2018. What you think their progress has been over the last 8 years?
Well, I think that after the report of the Work and Pensions Committee in 2019, it's certainly true that some things happened, discrete things happened. So there were, for example, some improvements in communications to carers. But what didn't happen was there was no overarching plan to address the recommendations that the committee made, to ensure that the issues and really the injustices that carers had faced with overpayments, suddenly being asked for, in some cases, large amounts of money to be paid back. There was no overarching plan and nobody senior tracking it. So I think more recently, by contrast, there is now, a set of actions against the recommendations that have been accepted, and there is a senior responsible officer appointed who is accountable for delivering with regular progress reports. So that should, make a significant difference. But I suppose in summary, you can bear in mind that there was a pandemic and that there were other priorities and so on. However, there was also a National Audit Office report in 2019. Very serious issues were identified, and they weren't new. Actually, there'd been a whistleblower earlier. These issues had been raised before, and relatively little happened, and it didn't happen in a strategic or sustained way between 2019 and sort of the present day, with the commissioning of this review and then a commitment to take some action.
No, that's very helpful indeed. So do you think that there has been a change in attitude and behaviour within the department? There is now a commitment to address the issues that we have seen?
Yes, I think that it's really welcome that government accepted or partially accepted almost all the recommendations. Some things have already happened. So, for example, I'm sure you know that the alerts on your employment and pay that came over from HMRC to the Department for Work and Pensions, so-called VEPs, in the period after 2019, only about 50% of those were actually being analysed and looked at, with the result that, for some people, the debt just rose and rose and they didn't know about it. Well, now there's a commitment to looking at 100% of those, and they've actually cleared the backlog. So as far as I can see, there shouldn't be a need for those sorts of debts to build up in future. If there are errors on the part of individual or department, they should be quickly identified and resolved. So things like that are happening. So I think you can see some progress. I mean,
Can I if I could interject just for
yes.
Very briefly. Clearly, was 38 out of the 40 recommendations were accepted by ministers. There was a surprising blog by a senior official, which seemed to again indicate that the fault was with the carers around their overpayments, so that was clearly not what you were saying, and not what ministers said. So was it your view that there was a disconnect between ministers and officials?
So I found a kind of mixed culture, I suppose. So I was really distressed by that blog, as I'm sure many people were, because what you were hoping for from senior people at that point was to really share with colleagues across the department, the seriousness of this, what's been learned, what's going to be put right, not an attempt to almost minimise it or to again place the responsibility back onto carers as if it was their fault, and which the review clearly found that it wasn't. And I can say more about that if you want to. So I think when I was doing the review, I found people at different levels who were serious about wanting to improve things amongst officials, including at the front line, trying to be more empathetic and so on. And since then, I can see that there are some people who are really wanting to learn and wanting to make change. But there's also sort of forces of resistance, if you like, which worry me. Yes. And it's about culture. It's also about a sort of a big department based on rules where things happen very slowly. Sometimes they happen slowly. So I think it's hugely important that the leadership of the department really kind of, sets that culture as it needs to be. I think it was good to see that almost as soon as that blog came out, ministers immediately said that's not the government position. I was very relieved to see that. I just happened to see it on TV. But also then the permanent secretary reinforced that. So that was good to see. But I think there's a job to be done to make sure that everybody is on the same page on this.
Indeed. And what should that job involve?
Yes, it's a really good question. So I mean, culture change is a difficult thing, isn't it? But I think the first thing is that there needs to be a modelling from senior people across the department about the importance of learning, the importance of getting things right for the people who are claiming the benefits. So, because I think sometimes, and maybe we'll come on to this, but sometimes I found that decisions were made sometimes too much in isolation. So, for example, this business of only looking at 50% of the VEPS alerts, if you looked at that strategically across the department, thinking about the objectives of carers allowance, from a senior perspective and what had happened with the 2019 reports, it seems to me extraordinary that you'd think it was acceptable to only look at 50%. Absolutely. If you look at it from a point of view of recouping money, it's public money, we've got to get it back, from a fraud and error point of view, then I can see it makes sense, but that's such a narrow perspective. So I think there's things about making sure that there's a join-up and the real values, the important values of serving people, and the purposes of carers allowance are front and centre and constantly, reinforced from senior people right across the department.
Thank you. You may be aware that this committee has done a lot around trying to get the focus on safeguarding across the department as well. So the points you're making are really resonate with us. But again, to try drive this point home, I wonder if you can describe what the human impact was on carers who were accused of deliberately seeking more money than they would otherwise get from carers allowance because of the deductions and so on that they had calculated.
Yeah, I think there were multiple human impacts. So, I mean, first of all, just the financial impact of having to pay back. So people talked about, I can no longer afford the small things like going out with the person I care for. The huge issue about people took it on, the shame, even when they didn't think they'd done anything wrong. And people were afraid to talk about it to their families and friends. I mean, I'm very grateful to carers organisations who brought people together to share experience. People talked about being overwhelmed by bureaucracy. You know, it's not a simple system. People talked about the impact on their health, not sleeping, really major impact on their own mental health, which then also impacted on their family members and their kids and the person they cared for. Though it was multifaceted, and people used terms like trauma, and I think not lightly, made to feel like a thief. I think this was a really horrendous experience for people who, the state seeks to support in that vital caring role, it's a consensual thing that society values carers and the contribution that carers make. But this felt like the absolute opposite of that.
No, you make that point so well, Liz. Thank you very much. My last question is, I think you commented on the fact that data collection was, in terms of DWP did not have or publish much up-to-date information on this. What should they be collecting as a matter of routine?
Yeah, I was really surprised that, for example, on the overpayments, there was no analysis of, does this apply more to people who are in work or not? What are the issues with overpayment? So, I mean, firstly, not only for publication, but for the department itself to understand and learn so that it can make good policy. So there were gaps, and I think that's something about perhaps carers' allowance not having a huge priority at a time when universal credit was a huge issue and other priorities. But so I think, firstly, it would be very useful to have data on the problems with overpayments by category. Are they about averaging? Are they about allowable expenses? Are they about people starting a new job and not telling the department? What are they about? Yes. Are they about back pay? All sorts of things. It would be useful to have ongoing tracking of civil penalties and administrative penalties. I mean, it was extraordinary that I found through the review that 46% of civil penalties issued by the department went to people on carers' allowance. And you kind of thought, surely somebody in the department might have found this statistic and thought, what's going on here? It's a relatively small benefit in terms of the numbers of people claiming it, and yet 46%. And if you looked at that for a moment, you'd think, this can't be right. What's going on here?
Exactly. Yeah.
So there's the importance of collecting data for themselves, and then the importance of transparency about some of that data, which I hope that this committee and others will want to ask for and see.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Joy Morris.
Thank you. Thank you for your report, because it's very useful and helpful. And your review found that the operational guidance on averaging earnings published in 2020 appeared to not have been developed with testing or input from the DWP policy or legal team. Do you think that this is reflective in how the DWP has approached carers' allowance more broadly, and what would be a sensible approach to averaging earnings moving forward?
Yes, so I think the fact that guidance was put out, I mean, again, it's an issue of was there enough joined up senior strategic oversight of that guidance, and I think it was signed off without enough of that. And what happened then was that averaging of earnings went from something that happened to something that members of staff in DWP said to me was vanishingly rare, or I've never known a case, or once in a blue moon. So that should have set off some alarm bells as well, incidentally. So I think I am making a general point about this, making sure that decisions are really grounded in the purposes of carers' allowance, in values, and are joined up across the different parts of the department. So averaging, yes. So we know that guidance has been revised. We don't know exactly how it's been revised. I recommended also that the regulations should be changed. The regulations are very ambiguous, and those regulations were passed in 1996, 30 years ago. There have been a lot of changes in the patterns of care and work since then, which I think we're all aware of. And I think that what we want is a system, what I think would make sense would be that people can work in a flexible labour market. They can know that if they take this shift, will they be better off or will they be worse off? Simple things, otherwise you can't run your life really. And that they should be able to take work around their caring responsibilities in a way that works for them and works for the person they care for. And I recommended, for example, that it should be possible for people to have a say in what period the averaging should be over. So some people wanted it aligned with the tax year. Some people, and there are complexities about that, but at the moment I don't know whether that is going to be in the guidance or indeed whether regulations will be changed. I think there is a need to make it much easier to average. It's, you know, we know that people have assumed, because it said on Gov UK your earnings may be averaged, many people assumed it would be over a year, or they assumed that they worked less this week because perhaps it was half term or some other reason, and then they work more next week, that would all be fine because of this averaging point. But it wasn't fine, and they didn't find out for some time. So there is something about making it much easier, and also making sure that things like if you get some back pay, or the employer's made a mistake and then they pay you what they should, that doesn't count as an overpayment, because it was pay for over a period of relevant to a period of months. So I think there's I don't know how much technical detail you want me to go into, but I think it is really important to find out, since the guidance has changed, what's now happening on averaging of earnings? Is it becoming more common? If not, why not? The staff now have to record the decision they make on averaging and why they made it. So I think that should be reported upon in general terms, and I think it should be asked whether and when the department is going to review and potentially revise those regulations, because the regulations of different tribunals have interpreted them differently. It's not exactly a clear set of regulations fit for the future, I would say.
On the back of that averaging earnings, do you think that is in coordination with the 46% of the issue with the penalties? Do you think the lack of a joined-up, regulated approach to averaging earnings is accounting for the penalties that we're seeing?
I think it's a factor that's definitely part of it. There will be other factors like people not understanding allowable expenses, for example. So there's probably there is a small range of factors, but I think definitely. What I heard in the review, both from carers and from DWP staff, was that lack of clarity on averaging was an absolutely fundamental issue.
And on the back of that, they're saying they're going to modernize the IT system, and this would provide, foundations for earnings and treatment for carers allowance. How confident are you that DWP will make those timely changes and that their IT system will reflect that?
I mean, at the moment, you've got IT systems that don't talk to each other, so to speak. So, for example, if you claim universal credit as well as carers allowance, and many people do, you might have an overpayment of carers allowance, but you might actually have a corresponding underpayment of universal credit, because they should sort of net off each other. But you don't get both those bits of information at the same time necessarily. And that's so. Or to give another example, you might have told universal credit about a change in your circumstances, so you think you've told DWP.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you might still, and I thought this was rather extraordinary, you might still get a civil penalty for not having told the carers allowance unit.
That's very poor.
And I recommended that that should not happen. And they've sort of accepted it, but it's kind of long term as they sort out the systems. Now, I think it would be good to keep on top of that because, sorry, I hope you don't mind me giving you suggestions, but just areas that you might want to ask the department about as you know, when they do their 6 monthly reports and so on. I think the thing is that obviously I didn't look at all the different IT priorities that exist across the department. But that issue about universal credit and carers allowance systems not being compatible to talk to each other has been known about for a long time, and it hasn't been addressed. So it's in the list of things to be addressed, but the question is when. And obviously it costs money, and obviously there are other priorities, but it seems to me there is an injustice here that needs to get up the priority list.
That's very helpful.
Thank you so much. Amanda Hack.
Thank you so much for coming to speak to us today, Liz. I think what's quite interesting about the previous question is about that sense that, you know, universal credit was 6 benefits into one, and this sits outside of that, yet can be claimed along the same time. So, that doesn't really make any sense, does it? You know, that is quite a odd thing to have sort of tried to deal with. When we're looking at the other range of benefits as a taper rate, so in terms of the DWP recommendations around looking at a taper rate and being in the discovery phase, what progress do you think DWP have made with that?
I'm afraid I don't really have full information. I know that they've kicked off the discovery phase of it, and that's been happening. So that's positive. But I mean, I think clearly it's going to be really important to keep track of that, and I'll be certainly interested to see how quickly that is progressed, because it would make such a huge difference. I mean, the cliff edge, I think when we looked at it at that time, and the rates may have changed, but I think you would have to go from £196 a week to something like 279 to be better off, bearing in mind that if you go over 196, you lose your carers allowance. So you're in a kind of benefit trap, and for so many people. I mean, I heard from somebody just a week or two ago who said she had changed jobs 3 times in order to avoid pay rises. I mean, is this sensible for the growth of the economy, for people's aspirations? You know, it doesn't make any sense, does it? And so there's a real problem about, and people saying, well, there's no point in doing a degree, or I'm a qualified teacher, but I'm taking a lower paid job because I'll be slightly better off that way with carers allowance. So there are real disincentives here to kind of progression and so on. So it's really important, I think, that the taper progresses swiftly, and I'm sorry I don't know further detail.
No, I think that's a really useful point. I think one of the things that has to be recognised is somebody caring for another person might not be forever as well. So actually looking at future employment opportunities, having that possibility for a teacher to do 2 extra days of supply, it's term time only, and the sense of averaging, all sorts to be pulled together as a sort of something that feels maybe more straightforward would be super helpful. So of the suggestions made to the review as how DWP could introduce a taper rate, were the ones that you were more persuaded by?
Because the work on the taper rate or the taper approach had already started in DWP when I was doing the review, I wasn't kind of asked to look at that specifically. So what I was kind of concerned about was, given that it seemed to be quite a long-term project, whether there was anything that could be done in the interim. And there were a couple of suggestions in the report for consideration that could be sort of workarounds while the systems and digital and so on legislative changes were taken forward. One such suggestion was there could be you could start implementing a taper before a digital solution with a clerical workaround. So because there's already clerical time looking at allowable expenses, this could be built in. That was one idea. Another idea was if you accepted the 52 weeks notion, you could look back over 52 weeks and say, okay, over the 52 weeks, by how much has this person gone over the limit? I mean, that would take some legislative change. But I think there are I was asking for kind of imaginative ways of doing something more quickly. I'm not aware that the department is pursuing those ideas, but that would be something to ask them about.
Do you think in terms of the ideas, though, there is already tried and tested within DWP, so the 17 weeks, you obviously if you're on a universal credit, the engagement with universal credit is via your workbook, so there are already things in place within the system. Was there any that you felt just actually it would make sense to align with?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And those carers who were also on universal credit sometimes spoke very positively about the universal credit system in comparison. Yeah. The way the taper worked, and also the fact that they knew exactly, they could log on to their journal and they could see what was happening. They could see the status of their claim. They could see how the taper had worked. Whereas with carers allowance, one of the big problems is there's a bit of a portal that you can submit some things. Some people are still incidentally having to send pay slips in and all sorts of really archaic approaches. But you don't know what's happened. You don't know. So I think, yes, the universal credit, I mean, there's still debates then where you set the taper, where you set it and so on, which I know DWP is looking at. But yes, I think the journal has met with some approval. I mean, it's not flawless, but it's a much more user-friendly system than the system for carers allowance, where if you don't know which expenses have been allowed and which haven't, how do you know if you've gone over the limit or not? Just what people get taken to us. Well, we would report a change of circumstances if we knew it was a change of circumstances, but we don't.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Joanna Baxter.
Thank you, Liz. And as a former trade union official, I know all too well the concern that people have around the impact of pay rises and the interaction with their benefits. So it's interesting what you were saying on that. Just in terms of your recommendation to the department that they publish standards for the department and its customers, they've obviously said that it already has a customer charter in place. Do you think that charter adequately sets out the sort of standards you would expect them to have?
I don't think it's strong enough, really. So, for example, on response times, one of the things that came through in the review was that sometimes, and maybe for understandable reasons, but DWP didn't respond very promptly. Somebody would communicate, by letter or whatever, and they didn't get a response in a swift timescale, but they were expected to respond within specified timelines. The charter says something like, don't quote me, these might not be the exact words, but it's something like, we'll reply as soon as we can. So then you think, well, can the carer reply as soon as they can then? There should be a kind of reciprocal, rights and responsibilities here, I think. Yeah. So I'd like to see it strengthened and, perhaps, I mean, I think there are, I may be wrong about this, but you might want to ask the carers organisations. I think there might be some discussions going on about that, but I think it would be really good to involve carers in what's missing from that charter and how could it be strengthened.
Do you think that the department adheres to the charter that's there at the moment in terms of how it communicates with its customers? Albeit I understand you don't think that that's a very strong document in the first place.
Well, I think that we can see that there is, satisfaction amongst carers allowance claimants with kind of, for a lot of people, it works okay. We are talking about a group of carers for whom it definitely has worked anything but okay. And I suppose, and I think the loose wording makes it perhaps slightly difficult to pin that down. But, I mean, on communications, I recommended, for example, that there should be something in between a very basic bit of information for people on Gov.uk and the Decision Makers Guide, which is pretty technical. And there should be scenarios, and people should be able to really understand. So I think the spirit of the Charter isn't quite there in terms of communications. I also think there are people in the Carers Allowance unit with real expertise. So if people ring up, the response times have improved, and the telephony was contracted out. But there's a kind of, the contracted out organisation can't put people through to somebody. So the contracted out service works really well if you want to say you've changed your address or, you know, something really straightforward. But they can't make decisions because they're not civil servants. So then they have to sort of send in a memo to the Carers Allowance unit, who will then get back to you. And if you are deemed to be vulnerable, they should get back to you within 24 hours. But if you're not deemed to be vulnerable, I mean, so I think, you know, experience varies as to how fast that is. Now, that's the sort of thing that it seems to me there should be standards. So I'm not sure if you could say that it's not complying with the Charter. I'd have to kind of look back at the wording of the Charter. But I think people need to get through to the answer to their question in a reasonable timescale.
Yeah.
And also it's not very convenient having to phone several times or wait for calls back when you're living the sort of life that we're talking about here, where you're caring for 35 hours a week and you're working. Yeah. You know, it's not straightforward.
It doesn't sound unreasonable. In terms of the Charter, I mean, on the basis that the Charter is there, the government have said that that is what exists. You recommended something else. But given that the Charter is there and it's currently not adequate in your view, what would you like to see built into that would more reflect some of the sort of standards that you would expect? I mean, obviously I appreciate that you've referenced reciprocal. That's the term. That term, in terms of expectations. But is there anything else specifically that you think the government could include in the Charter at the moment that would help?
So I think promptly, letting people know transparently what about decisions and why they've been made. So government has committed actually to, for example, telling people how their earnings have been averaged. I think that would be very helpful because that hasn't been happening. I mean, there's quite a lot of detail in that, isn't there? So what needs to be in a charter, but some sort of, at least to give people, carers allowance recipients specifically, some expectation that they will be able to understand how their claim and the response they claim has been worked out, and also that if there's an overpayment, that they should be informed quickly. I mean, clearly that's been a really serious problem that these debts built up to, in some cases, thousands and thousands of pounds, which people could ill afford and they didn't know were building up, and that's not acceptable. So I think something that says, it should be possible to meet that now that they've got the HMRC alert system working more to 100%.
Thank you.
Thank you. John Mill.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming in this morning. There's a duty on carers to report changes in their circumstances, overpayments. There's a duty on DWP to inform in a timely and clear way their expectations. Do you think that the DWP has the balance right in expectations on carers?
So I probably better talk from the position of when I was doing the review, so bearing in mind that there are some changes in train. But it seemed to me that at that point the balance wasn't right. And that's because people have a responsibility to report change of circumstances, and quite right too. You're receiving public money in a benefit. I would agree with that. But for that to be fair and for you really to have that responsibility, what you have to report in, there has to be information on that, communication on that, that is clear, unambiguous, and consistent. And I don't think it was any of those. On averaging, and also I thought on allowable expenses, and the government didn't agree about that. But certainly on averaging, evidently there was guidance that didn't comply with the legal regulations. And the information on so people didn't not know what they had to report. And that is, I think, why so many people got civil penalties, disproportionately as compared to people on other benefits who also have to report change of circumstances in many of those benefits. So it just wasn't clear enough. On allowable expenses, incidentally, I mean, I recommended there could be better alignment with HMRC. So they have, allowable expenses, but they're slightly different. Now, there are cases where it's sensible for them to be different. For example, there's an allowable expense that you might pay for somebody to be there to care for the person you care for while you're at work. That's very specific to carers' allowance. But most of the other things, like, equipment, uniform, travel while you're at work, these sorts of things, also are there in HMRC, but they're different. Well, why are they different? That's just confusing. People thought it was one, not the other. So I think it's really important that the information. So I think there are improvements in train and in the planning, and I'm very pleased that the department is working with carers organisations to look at the communications and aim to improve them. So I think that could make a big difference. But when I was there looking at it, there was not that. So it wasn't a fair area of responsibility, and that's partly to go back to the chair's question about the blog. That's partly why I think it caused such concern that there was this implication again that it was carers that hadn't done what they should have done. And actually, that's what carers were told when they were given the debt and given this £50 civil penalty, which people felt was a real insult. So I think it's very important to say that, there were a huge number of carers who inadvertently went over the earnings limit because they didn't understand the system, and that was because it wasn't easy to understand and it wasn't clear.
And in relation to that blog post, which, as you say, put the blame squarely on the carers, the most concerning thing about that is that we only found out about it by accident.
Yes.
So from the outside, it looked like a very different world, and they did accept that balance, that criticism. Given that, do you think? I'm a big fan of civil service. I back them all the way, but it is concerning that we didn't know that. Do you think that there is a culture problem at DWP, that they are capable of reforming themselves by themselves, or do they need stronger outside scrutiny?
It's very difficult for me to say about DWP in general because I only looked at this case in particular. I think there are some senior people who are serious about making the changes that are needed. I felt that sometimes there was almost the kind of effort to almost minimise what had gone wrong was almost to kind of reassure staff that they hadn't done anything. And actually that's the wrong thing to do as a leader in such a circumstance. What you need to do, I think, is to own the problem, explain why the system wasn't right. The staff are working in an imperfect system, in that they were working in a very imperfect system in that case. So there is another way to make the staff feel all right about it and bring them with you on the journey to where you want to really get this right. So it needs very proactive leadership. That needs to come from the top. But it also needs to, you need distributed leadership around that, that's reinforced in every team and so on. I don't think I can really answer that question about DWP in general. But
as an example of it,
as an example of it, well, it might help them to have some external support with the culture change piece. I think it's important with culture change to understand where you're at, to understand what you're doing to shift the culture and to track it, and to the senior team needs to be on that case. So it needs to be a bit more systematic than just good intent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lee Barron.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for coming in. Two fairly sort of short and succinct questions from me. The first one being, how satisfied were you with the government's response to recommendations to reclassify some overpayments as official error?
Well, I think that I was pleased that government agreed to reassess a lot of claims and, in some cases, to write off debts and repay them in whole or in part, including repaying where merited civil penalties and administrative penalties. So I think that's quite a big thing for a government department to do, so that's positive. I suppose that the devil is going to be in the details. So, we're hoping that fairly soon, I don't know when, the reassessment process will start. I think the critical question is going to be, what are the criteria for that reassessment? I know they've done this sample of 1,000 cases and come up with this estimate of 26,000 people. I've not seen the breakdown of that 1,000. What were the other categories as well as the averaging? What kind of averaging is being included here? So I'd want to be assured that, back pay, employer error, and over what periods can averaging occur? Because I think that the criteria will match the new guidance. So is the new guidance good enough? And will these criteria be good enough? Who's going to get their debts written off and who is not going to get their debts written off, and will that be fair and will it redress injustice sufficiently? I suppose those are the questions that are in my mind, and I don't know the answers until that process and the way that it's being done becomes clearer. But I think they're very, very important questions, because government's done a big thing by saying, yes, this was wrong and we're going to repay some debts and write some debts off. But actually it's so important that they get this right now. And, don't fall at this hurdle.
Okay, thanks. And are there any unanswered questions that were not included in the terms of reference of the review, or explored in previous reviews or inquiries that you believe warrant further investigation?
There's quite a few things that are in the review. I hope this is not too much of a sidetrack, where it's maybe not quite clear yet what exactly they've accepted or partially accepted a recommendation, but what exactly they're going to do might not yet be quite clear. Or they've rejected a recommendation, but they've said they'll do something. So, for example, fraud and error statistics. I was, given what we've just been saying about people made to feel like a thief and the rate of civil penalties, I was concerned that in the official statistics, 100 million of 166, I think it was, something like that, was classified as fraud of carers' allowance overpayment. And that's on the basis of a definition of fraud, which is kind of it's something like you should reasonably have known. Sorry, I can check the detail if you want to follow up on it, what you should have done. That differs from the HMRC definition of fraud, which has something about deliberate intent in it. It's not fraud to a lay person if you inadvertently go over an earnings limit and don't report a change of circumstance because you didn't know what you had to report. That's not fraud, to my mind, but it might be classified as fraud in statistics, and I think that distorts public debate. So the government rejected that recommendation, but they did say that they would try and put some more explanatory detail into statistics. So, I mean, that would be good if they did that, and that sort of thing. They also rejected one on doing an internal audit. This is slightly relevant to the culture and processes point, to make sure that the setup is now well positioned to take forward the recommendations and improvement. They rejected that on the basis that they had enough insight from the Work and Pensions Committee report, the NAO report, my review. So I think it would be very interesting to know how they are using those insights to improve. So there's lots of things like that that are, and there are others in the detail of the recommendations. I mean, in terms of things that go beyond the recommendation, I mean, clearly, you know, carers allowance is 50 years old this year. It was developed in a very different era, when most women didn't work, when the pattern of the labour market was very, very different. Caring has changed since then. And so I mean, there's lots of things I'm sure to look at with carers allowance, but I think that was sort of beyond my brief, but maybe the next session can address some of them.
Thank you, Lee. And thank you, Liz. This has been absolutely fascinating and really important for how we seek to hold the government to account on their commitments. Order. Order, and welcome to the second panel of this one-off oral evidence session on carers' benefits beyond the Sayce review. And we're delighted to welcome Emily Holzhausen, Director of Public Affairs at Carers UK, Kirsty McHugh at the Carers Trust, Professor Anne McMunn from the University College London, and Dr. Maxine Watkins from the University of Birmingham. So thank you again for joining us. I'm going to start if that's okay. It's Liz, you obviously heard her testimony before. I mentioned in terms of we're coming up to the 50th anniversary of the first iteration of carers allowance, the invalid care allowance, and I wondered how you thought we have progressed and whether the current system of carers benefits is fit for purpose. Who would like to start with that?
I'd be delighted to start. It was our organisation, the National Council for the Single Woman and Her Dependents, that fought very hard for this allowance and got it eventually in 1976. But the level of it, if we look next year, £86.45 per week, for which you have to provide 35 hours of care, works out at about £2.47 per hour. It's the lowest benefit of its kind. And as Liz has said, you know, things have moved on, time has moved on. The interaction of carers allowance with universal credit is not perfect. And we see about 62% of carers who get carers allowance who are in poverty. So there's complex interactions with, it overlaps with the state pension, and easier ways that we could look at that. So it's high time we had a review after 50 years of the benefit. It's an extremely important benefit that has enormous value. We're an organisation of carers, run by carers, and even though it's a very low benefit, and carers think that's a disgrace, to be honest, it has enormous value for them because it values what they do. So there are all sorts of things we would like to see changed. The level, means-tested benefits like care element go up, better interaction with benefits for older carers, people caring for multiple people, and students. But there's some changes in Scotland as well that have been brought forward that are positive, but it's a long-standing call for us now to have a review. The last major set of benefits changes were around 2000, and they were quite significant at the time, but I think the evidence today will show that we need one of those, a refresh and review.
Thank you. Kirsty?
Completely agree with that. So my organisation, Carers Trust, runs services, the local services for carers around the country, including in your constituencies. So go and see them if you haven't already. I came into this area 4 years ago. I looked at Carers Allowance and thought, what is this? What is the philosophical underpinnings of this? What is it trying to achieve? And I was talking to someone a few weeks ago who had been involved decades ago in Carers Allowance policy. And he said, you've got to understand, Kirsty, that this was introduced as pin money for what were then called spinsters. People who didn't have a husband to look after them, but they were looking after maybe their elderly parents, and it was thought important to give them an independent piece of money, pin money. It's extraordinary. So what's Carers Allowance trying to do? Is it about sort of helping people balance sort of work and care? Is it about income replacement? And it doesn't know what it's trying to do, and that's why it doesn't relate easily to any other benefits and needs a complete and utter look at again. Interlinked to a lot of other policy areas, whether that's sort of education, retirement, etc. So it's a bit of a mess.
Who would like to go next? Yes, Maxine.
So following on from the comments about the low level of carers allowance, our research with the Centre for Care, we found that the low level didn't only have a negative impact on people's material well-being, but it also had a negative impact on their kind of wider sense of well-being, because they felt undervalued for the work that they were doing, and they felt that the contribution that they were making to society wasn't recognised. So I think it's just a point to note as well that it kind of can impact on the way people feel, the low payment as well.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And do you want to say?
So our project has focused on the impact of providing unpaid care at different stages of the life course on people's health primarily. So we haven't investigated carers allowance per se, but when we talk to carers, it's very much in line with what's been said about the level simply not being enough to provide adequate financial support for them.
Thank you. Thank you all. So obviously you listened to Liz earlier. I just wondered what you thought of the government's response to her review.
I'm happy to go first. I gave evidence to this committee when it last did its inquiry. I have to say Liz has done an extraordinary piece of work, and 38 out of 40 recommendations accepted. It was unprecedented, really, within the history of carers allowance that government has admitted a mistake, and Secretary of State and ministers have said very clearly they want to rebuild trust with carers, and that's so important. DWP is an absolutely critical service for people who rely on that day in, day out, and that trust has been badly broken. So we really we really welcome that. I think some of it we have to look under the hood of the car, if you like, to see what exactly do different things mean. There are some really important building blocks, like, for example, the reassessment exercise, and what Liz said about transparency is critically important. Letters being changed, for example, to tell people not just how much the overpayment is, but how did we work this out and over what period. We run an information advice service which responds to about 20,000 inquiries from carers a year. It's a guessing game for us to try and guess how that overpayment is made up. So how do you then challenge it? So there are some very important practical things. There are a few areas where the government didn't accept the recommendations, like allowable expenses. The government did not accept that the information was unclear. But our test for the information of all of it is, can a carer know where they stand in terms of their income? If I take that shift, will I go over the limit? And allowable expenses is poorly understood, and really you don't know until the DWP has come back to say yes. There are 3 areas where it's very clear, but nevertheless there are a few outstanding areas: timescales around taper, timescales around modernising the programme as well, which are critically important. But really have to commend the government for setting up the independent review in the first place.
Thank you. Kirsty?
Again, I agree with that. I want to pick up the point about culture that you asked Liz earlier. Emily and I went to see the Preston Carers Allowance Unit, where they're going to be doing the looking at the impact of the independent review, putting that into operation, but they do the processing generally. And it was fascinating, because what we found there was a lot of frontline staff who did seem really dedicated to carers, really understood their circumstances, a lot of picking up the phone and talking to them. Really what we saw was very supportive cultures. However, that does not, they are completely let down by systems, antiquated, extraordinary computer systems which you wouldn't believe. In this day and age, you should be able to tell the government once. A lot of carers feel that that's the case, and of course that's not the way it operates. If you're a frontline staff member in DWP, you're having to look across different systems. And of course the rules for carers allowance are really complicated, even before you get to averaging. And so I think that there's that typical sort of policy frontline work disconnect that can go on, and the job of the DWP is to make sure they strengthen that communication internally, so what the staff is telling them actually does influence the policy changes there.
Thank you. And Maxine? Anything to add?
I don't have anything to add on that, but I did want to just highlight something that delighted me, which was in the foreword to the government's response. I did see a statement about the government's commitment to creating a national care service, which I recognize is outside DWP's remit, but I think is crucial. I'm hoping that Baroness Casey's review on adult social care will be looking at that, and it's really imperative that unpaid carers and support for unpaid carers is part of that.
Thank you very much. David Baines.
Thanks, Chair. Everyone. There are about 4,500 people in receipt of carers allowance in St Helens, and what I've heard so far does chime with what I hear from them. Could you describe for me, in your view, the immediate and long-term financial impact of caring on individuals? And I know, Maxine, you just co-authored a report very recently on this subject, so maybe if we start with you.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So I probably first should say in our research we spoke with carers in different life stages, and we talked to them in depth about their caring journeys, so their kind of life before caring, the point that they started caring, and then also the decisions that they made around work and care and what influenced those decisions, and so the financial implications of those, both short and longer term. Obviously, there's the short kind of out-of-pocket expenses that we know about that carers have to make, such as, petrol payments, shopping for the person they care for, those kind of shorter term and adjustments at home and things like that. We were particularly interested about the risks to future financial well-being. So, for example, a carer in midlife. I'm thinking particularly of one carer called Emily. She was caring for her mum. She was a carer in midlife. She'd had multiple episodes of caring across her life. And as she was reaching retirement, she was realising that although she'd done 40 years of service where she worked, she'd only got 25 reckonable years of service in terms of a pension. So coming up to retirement, she was then realising that her pension was going to be inadequate, and that was, really stressing her. She hadn't really thought about it until that time, as so many people don't. And so there's those kind of examples where if she'd have known in pounds and pence what difference it might have made to go part-time at the point of caring. I mean, I don't want to stop anybody that wants to go part-time and care, but I do think that people should have, full information about the financial implications of that. So if perhaps employers could kind of give some guidance in pounds and pence terms, what difference will this make to your pension? People are making decisions then with the knowledge. So I think kind of longer term, in terms of young carers, which we might speak about separately later, we talked to carers that were choosing to, not take progression opportunities. A young apprentice carer that wanted to do extra study to be able to progress in the future, but didn't feel that would be sustainable with his care work. So, lots of kind of longer term financial consequences that perhaps carers don't think about at that initial point of deciding to care.
I would just add to that the quantitative data really back up the financial impact of care. So there was the most rigorous study I've seen so far on the income penalty of care, actually done by the Centre for Care. Maxine's colleagues showed a 45% impact of care on income. And the work that we've done has shown that the income differences between carers and non-carers are stronger in that midlife period, the kinds of years when people will be combining care with employment. So I think that's a real area for focus.
So it's about poverty, inability to work, etc. Our studies showed that about 40% of unpaid carers were forced out of the workplace, and an additional 23% had to radically reduce their hours. And the DWP stats show 17% of people on carers allowance work. But actually a lot more could work if they had the right support and there was flexible employment, and carers allowance enabled that. So we did a piece of work with an organisation called Cambridge Econometrics, looking at not just, basically the cost to the Treasury, whether it's benefits, lost tax takes, but also the loss in terms of household income. Probably about 500,000 working age people, carers, might be able to do some level of paid work if we had the system more flexibly. And that really sort of picked up two groups in particular: women aged 50 to 64, but also young adult carers. 70,000 of those, aged 16 to 24, are not working and really should be economically active at that point in their lives. So there's some big figures there who are really impacted by having a heavy caring role.
If I could just add to that, I agree with everything that colleagues have said. This is also heavily gendered as well. The vast majority of people in receipt of carers allowance are women. And that peak age of 50 to 64 is just critical for pensions. So we see carers being underpensioned. Last year we published a piece of work asking carers what would you have done differently, which speaks to Maxine, falls into four groups. I would have stayed in work for longer. I would have put more into my pension. I would have found out about my benefits and entitlements and other support available sooner, and I would have recognised myself as a carer quicker. So those 4 are key areas where we need to invest in prevention. And the labour market, what employers do is just as important as what DWP and other agencies do.
How well would you say, you probably just already answered, but if you maybe want to sum it up, how well would you say support for carers supports the department's responsibility to help people plan and save for later life?
It's really interesting. So if we look at some of the work, for example, about 1/3 of the population of carers sort of starts caring every year and 1/3 stops caring. That's 12,000 people a day. It's very unpredictable. Most people, when you look at polling, most people kind of expect to care at some point in their life, but it's very difficult to plan for. And our systems and processes aren't really set up through DWP or through society to plan for that. So it's very easy to get to a point where when you ask carers, Carers Week did a piece of work asking carers whether they had a choice about caring, and 62% said they didn't have a choice because no other care alternatives were available. So people are sort of bounced into it because of duty, love, and no alternative. So that's why we need a modern system. We need employers to be supporting carers more, paid carers leave as an entitlement, as a right, for example, would help people to juggle work and care. We have very solid evidence on that. And the flexible working changes that are being brought through the Employment Rights Bill are very valuable, but we still need to raise awareness in that age group.
But it's also about employment support systems, which are by and large funded by DWP. Yeah. That bit's also important.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Joanna Baxter.
Morning, everybody. So, Emily, you referenced earlier the situation in Scotland, and we know that carers in Scotland receive an additional support through the Carers Allowance Supplement, which is soon to be the Scottish Care Supplement. Can you say a little bit more on the impact that supplement has had on carers in Scotland?
Sure. The Scottish Government, so it's worth approximately £11 a week. It's paid in 2 payments, 6 monthly, and the Scottish Government are moving from 6 monthly to weekly or monthly based on what carers have said, and it won't come as a surprise to you that people on low incomes, as all MPs, you'll know this, people on low incomes find regular payments much easier to manage. And they've done a study of 114 people, and it has made a difference. There are high levels of poverty in Scotland anyway, so you can't compare like with England. And it has made a material difference to people. People say that their recognition is more positive, mental health and well-being, as Maxine and Anne mentioned. They are also spending things on things that other people take for granted, like a small trip out. Breaks are critically important for carers' well-being. But they're also spending it on necessary bills, paying the bills, paying the everyday costs, travel, heating bills, medical equipment, where costs are high or the state falls short. But the long and the short of it is that £11 a week has been very important. Kirsty.
Well, they've also done a few other things which is going to be really interesting, including there's a carer additional person payment, which is £510 per year. Because at the moment, you don't get more money through carers allowance if basically it's only one person. If you're caring for 2 people, and that takes you up to 35 hours a week, that doesn't work in terms of carers allowance. It's only associated with one person. But in Scotland, you can now get this additional £510 if you are caring for more than one person. They've also removed what we call the 21-hour rule, which in England means that you have to choose between carers allowance and full-time study. And with things like T-levels, we think it's really important that we do that in in England as well. And there's a few other things, you know, so you can have carers allowance posted if somebody dies. You know, it runs on now for longer in Scotland. So there's a few things that they've changed, but it'll probably take a bit longer to see what the impact of that is.
Just on that, are the demographics of carers in Scotland different in terms of the rest of the United Kingdom that would justify some of those additional measures?
About 95,000 people, I think, get carers allowance, the care allowance supplement in December 2025. So that's quite a good pool of people to get some evidence in relation to that. The answer, though, is no. It's not sufficiently different to say this wouldn't be useful elsewhere. Emily, you'd agree?
Yeah, I'd agree. Carers tend to be older in Wales. That's the only really significant difference we see between different nations.
Thank you.
Thank you. John Mill.
Thank you, Chair. And this is a question for Anne in particular. Is there anything we can learn about the differential health outcomes for unpaid carers across Europe and how it's affected by state support? For instance, Norway and Germany do very well, but what observations would you have?
Yeah, before I get into the European differences, I'll just say a little bit about what we find in the UK in relation to care and health, because actually we're really lucky in the UK to have really robust longitudinal survey data. So we've been able to look at trajectories of physical and mental health before people become carers, during that transition into beginning to provide care, and then in the years after. And we're able to compare that with matched controls who don't take up care. And we see an immediate spike in psychological distress symptoms during that transition into becoming a carer. And we see that persists for several years after making that transition. We see that that's concentrated amongst people, particularly under the age of 65, but for everyone if they're providing more intense care. And by that we mean 20 hours a week or more, or living with the person that they're caring for. So if we then look across Europe, what we've been able to do in our project is create a measure of care regimes based on 5 indicators of how much state support is being invested into the care system. And what we find is 3 kind of key findings. First, carers in countries with high levels of support tend to care for fewer hours. And this is actually a really consistent finding across the literature. So, for example, we find that for carers age 50 plus, a third are caring intensively in countries with low state support, compared with 10% in countries with high state support. But we also find that more people are providing care. So it seems that if you're in a country where you're getting enough support to care for fewer hours, and you can then combine that potentially with employment and other activities, people are more willing to provide care. The second finding is that the gender inequity that we see in relation particularly to the hours of care that people are doing, which is a really consistent and strong finding, is much smaller in countries that have high state support for care. So female carers are 64% more likely than male carers to care intensively in low support countries, and 34% more likely in high support countries. And the third finding is that midlife deterioration of mental health that I talked about in relation to care is actually much smaller in countries with high levels of support. So, for example, in Norway, which was one of our partners in the Eurocare project, we see that when people become carers in midlife, there's no impact on their well-being in Norway. So, altogether, we can say that state support for care allows people to participate more fully in care, but at levels that are compatible with maintaining employment, good mental health, and reducing gender inequity.
Thank you. Very, very big differences. Very interesting. Yeah. And do you think there are any changes to carers' benefits that we can make that would help prevent worsening health outcomes?
So one consistent finding in all of our work is that 20 hours or more per week seems to be a real threshold for impacts on people's mental health in particular. So I guess one thing that might suggest for carers allowance is that we could look at a threshold more like 20 hours per week rather than the 35 hours that is the current threshold. And then beyond carer's allowance, I think what really seems to help is having universal systematic access to high-quality respite care, ideally through a kind of national care service that kind of is looking at the whole picture. So, you know, we need a system in which carers have support to be able to get out and participate in employment. We're concerned about economic inactivity in this country. So in countries where people have care available to them that they can then go and participate in employment, they're more likely to do so. Similarly, we don't see that impact on mental health when people have those care services, alternative care services available to them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Lee Barron.
Thank you, and thanks everybody. Good to see you. Many carers themselves are disabled or have long-term health conditions. How could and should the DWP tailor carers' benefits and the support they provide to that group?
We have a very good question, and particularly when we've been looking at disability benefits and the changes to PIP. So we have about 150,000 people who are disabled and get disability benefits and also get carer's allowance. And it is absolutely possible to be both and do both. And carers gave us very good examples of that. You know, people with physical disabilities looking after son, daughter with learning disability, visual impairments, and, you know, in similar situations looking after partners. So there's a whole range of ways that we need to consider this. So first, in the TIMS review, there's been a pledge to make sure that carers are involved, because carers allowances, disability benefits are a gateway benefit for carers allowance. You have to be getting a disability benefit, so it's critically important to us and the future of how carers are able to claim. The second thing is around when we moved to universal credit, it was possible to get two separate premia. A carer premium and a disability premium. It's not possible now. You can only get one or the other. So I don't know how many people have lost out as a result of that. But one thing we've asked for, and there's a brilliant piece of work by the Institute of Employment Studies looking at return to work support, is that the DWP doesn't always know, for example, who is caring as well as having a disability. It doesn't always collect that data, and it's not always related to whether you get carer's allowance or not. You know, you might not qualify for carer's allowance. You might only be doing 10 or 20 hours a week. So the DWP having a much better idea of and recording of who has got caring responsibilities would then help to tailor the kinds of support it needs. And when it's looking at so with Sir Charlie Mayfield's review, again, we have this health and care overlap that it's very important to look at. And there's a number of measures, you know, again, with employers, understanding that overlap between people who have health issues whilst working, some of which come from caring, some of which are made worse by caring, some of which are completely independent of caring. But that overlap is just another layer that people have to deal with. So we would recommend Sir Charlie Mayfield, and the Keep Britain Working review also had a specific lens on carers, and particularly, you know, how employers, occupational health supports carers.
Yeah, completely agree. Only thing I'd like to add is that we did pick up whispers, rumours that maybe there was a view in some parts of the DWP that if you were in receipt of PIP, you really couldn't be that disabled if you were caring for 35 plus hours a week. So just, it would be really good as a committee if you just could keep an eye on that.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. And it's Joanna Baxter.
How significant an impact will the government's decision to link the earnings limit on carers allowance to 16 hours at the national living wage be on carers' ability to combine caring and employment? don't know who wants to go first.
Very happy to go first. So first of all, I would say if you talk to carers, they generally don't know what the earnings limit is. A large proportion don't know. So, and because it changes every year, it was a really significant decision to raise it to the same level as the national living wage. Every year it has cuts. Every year carers have been having to, prior to this decision, reduce the amount of work that they were doing by 20 minutes, by 30 minutes, you know. And as we've said, people couldn't take extra shifts, they couldn't take pay rises, so it's really significant. I'm just going to look for my statistics now. We asked carers about what difference it had made, and around 1/3 said it would allow them to take more work, bearing in mind that some people didn't know about it. However, the real challenge with the earnings limit is the lack of a taper, and people are terrified of going over that limit. So they try, a lot of people try and stay below it. When you talk to carers who have work, asking them, is this a choice? And it is partially a choice, but it's also financially critically important for people. So just like to thank the government for making that and bring on the taper really as soon as possible. We will see more people. I mean, it was estimated that about 60,000 more carers would benefit. This is something that would really be enhanced if we could get that taper right and quickly.
Are there any other mechanisms you think the department could use to help carers who wish to be in work other than the taper?
Yes, I mean, at the moment there's not a work allowance for carers, for example, within universal credit. So there are other work allowances that people can get if you have a disabled partner or children. But, for example, a mum whose son or daughter becomes an adult, there's no longer a work allowance for them, and we all accept that those other groups, people's ability to work is curtailed because of other types of caring. So this is something that we would like to see the Department for Work and Pensions say the vast majority of carers are covered by other types of work allowances. But if we're looking at a level playing field for carers, we could introduce a work allowance for people. It would also support people caring for parents, for example. And it's just that, you know, allowing people the link with the labour market could make a difference. So we would advocate for that.
But we need good systems to underpin all these things. You know, it is just ridiculous at the moment. So making sure this is integrated at a system level, I think, is absolutely essential. Otherwise, we're going to get even more of a mess.
And also, I think, going back to the point that was made by several of us about the kind of decisions around work and care at that point, initial point of starting to care, extended periods or a period of paid leave at that starting point of caring in people's lives would give them the opportunity to find out further information, find out what care services are available, and, you know, to consider the options at that point. And because people are making decisions about care in times of crisis, in really high stress situations, as Anne said, and so having a period where they've got that financial security to put trusted and appropriate and affordable care into place, if they can do that, that would help people to stay in the workplace.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on that on carers leave. So in the countries where we see carers combining care with an employment more, they do have much more generous carers leave, because the assumption is that most carers are employed and working. So they'll have, I think Norway has 3 weeks at pay replacement, so full income earnings replacement. And it might just provide that space for people to get things set up, for example, and not have to exit the labour market.
So if I could just add, the government is reviewing carers leave at the moment. So it would be an opportunity to look at paid carers leave, and it has pledged to do that, which we estimate would cost between £5 and £32 million a year, based on carers' actual take-up rates. You know, working with employers and looking at what they do.
Thank you.
Thank you. John Milne.
Thank you, Chair. There are lots of different benefits out there. They do different jobs, they've got different rules, and they interact in quite complicated ways. Mm-hmm. Do you have any suggestions on how we might improve that or make it easier for the consumer, as it were? I don't know who wants to.
Well, I think as someone, I think it was Liz mentioned before, certainly universal credit and having a journal or something like that for carers where they have much more, much easier interaction. As Kirsty mentioned, some of the processes would also really help staff if we could automate some of this, if we are able to gather that information much easier. Our test is one of the challenges we have at the moment with systems not talking to each other. When the Department of Work and Pensions says, tell us about your changes, we've got examples of carers telling universal credit colleagues about changes in circumstances, but they need to tell the carers allowance unit. And so it's these knit up of different systems that's absolutely critical, and will ultimately lead to a better service for people, as well as it's very frustrating to work with difficult processes. So I think staff are doing a very good job often without the right systems and processes in place. So we would recommend that. We would also say as well that communications is critically important, transparent, open, what's on the website, how are you communicating to people. We're talking about a very, very busy, hard-pressed population, as you know, who have very little time. So it has to be clear.
Any additions to that?
Okay, conscious of the time.
Very good there. Thank you. Carers organisations have also raised concerns about the potential impact of PIP reforms on people in receipt of carers benefits. That one carers allowance can depend on a PIP award. What solutions do you think DWP could use to address that problem? Would you like to take that?
Well, with the previous proposals, the changes in the points system would have meant quite a significant impact on carers' ability to claim carers' allowance. So it's just a couple of lines, but would have affected about 150,000 carers, which was very significant. And we found carers providing very important levels of care to people who would have lost out with that point system. So with the TIMS review, I think really understanding how disability, how these things are measured within the department is critically important. The review has said that it will consult with carers and carers organisations, so including both of our organisations, and we would strongly recommend they take evidence as well from carers and really get a feel for how that is impacted. A few of the people who have been appointed to the committee have caring responsibilities as well, so there's an element of knowledge there, but we really need to recognise the importance of that review and how that affects carers' abilities to claim their own income. They were distraught with the last process. It was very painful with the legislation going through. So we are pleased that the review has been set up and will consider these things.
Yeah, a very important point, I think. Any? Okay.
Yep. So on kind of navigating the benefits system more broadly. Our participants have talked about the difficulties in accessing financial support, and they talked about, as has been mentioned here, like the complex interactions between benefits, and that was often a barrier to claiming support. So, for example, one carer, they'd got a household income of like around £20,000, and she was put off claiming carers allowance because she knew that it would impact her mum, who she cared for, the severe disability premium. Yeah. So, that sort of interaction between benefits can often act as a barrier, and the complexity there. I mean, following on from that, I'm actually currently working on another project within the Centre for Care, and it looks at complexities in the benefit system. And in that project, we've spoken to welfare rights advisors and how they help people navigate through, which is, an essential service for some claimants because of the complexity of the system. And we found that complexity is kind of undermining the core aims of carers allowance as well. We're actually presenting those findings at a DWP seminar next week, so if anybody wants to listen in.
Very topical.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Amanda Hack.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming to speak to us. The question that I've got is around young adult carers, but I think we just need to recognise there are lots of under 16s who are caring too, and there is actually one of the things that's quite interesting is how do young adult carers get picked up through that journey and actually identified as and maybe requiring that additional financial support. But first to Anne, if I may, how does the experience of young adult carers in the UK compare to that of young carers in other countries? And how is that impacted by the support provided by government?
So in the UK, we find that young adult carers are 38% less likely to get a university degree compared with non-carers. And if they're caring intensively for 35 hours a week or more, that goes up to 86% less likely to get a university degree. They're also 50% less likely to enter employment. So we know we currently have concerns about inactivity amongst young adults, and so care really plays a role there. What we also find is that those who do get a university degree, that impact on employment isn't there. So if we can get them into some kind of further or higher education, that is really helpful. In terms of the international comparisons, the other country where we have sort of longitudinal data as good as in the UK is Germany, and we've replicated our analysis there and found pretty much identical results. And in kind of different kinds of survey data across Europe, we consistently see that young adult carers are less likely to be in employment, education, or training, really across the board than non-carers. So it's not like the kind of wider care picture where we can look to good models in Europe and say this might be something we'd like to emulate. I think we actually, with young adult carers and young carers, the UK is kind of at the forefront, I think, of starting to recognize the issue here. There's still a lot to be done. So we mentioned the 21-hour rule. That is an obvious answer. That's a real barrier to young people taking up full-time university education or any higher education. So they've done away with it in Scotland, and I think that's really something to be considered. The other thing is young people who are caring for really long hours. So the census showed recently that young adult carers 14% are caring for 35 or 50 hours a week or more. So 50 hours a week, 14% doesn't sound like a lot, but no young people should be caring for 50 hours per week. So we really need other systems in place that ensure that doesn't happen. Early identification is key, and you mentioned that. A lot of young people don't think of themselves as carers. So we need young care policy leads, policies and leads in education, colleges, universities. We need to ensure that staff in education have awareness training and are aware of what the warning signs might be, persistent absenteeism, things like that. Young carers talk about as being things that have helped them be identified in the system. And also, when people are diagnosed with chronic conditions, a kind of systematic assessment of, is there a young person involved in this situation, and can they be referred to services within that kind of health setting?
Thank you. No, that's really useful. Kirsty, you want to comment?
We run the Young Carers Alliance in the UK, Young Carers Services Alliance in Scotland. And the Education Select Committee has taken a real interest in relation to this around identification, etc., which is really good. One thing I would sort of flag, we've been started a conversation with Baroness Smith, the relevant cross-departmental minister, about pathways for young adult carers. There's about 2 in every classroom, but they sort of they fall off the system really at FE, and apprenticeships don't work for them. And so we need more flexibility for them to have pathways from education into the workforce. Concentrated in more economically deprived areas as well. So there's a geographical element to this, which is really important. But they're hidden within the stats, and a lot of the youth employment support young adult carers, by and large, hugely responsible individuals. They're taking on huge responsibility within the households. They're running the finances. They're dishing out medicine. They're looking after younger siblings. They're talking to the hospital, etc. They've got a different set of barriers to maybe other young people who are not in education, employment, or training, and the system does not recognise that, whether that's apprenticeships or employment support. So and the financial stuff, they are making a choice between full-time education and because and carers allowance, and that's bonkers at that age.
Lovely. I think there is that relationship between young carers and not being in education, training, or employment, and that 21-hour rule is sort of, it all conspires for that young person not to continue in education. I think also what Kirsty identifies is that quite often the caring is actually, for a young person, intergenerational. They may be looking after a parent that's unwell and making sure their younger siblings get to school. So it's actually that caring responsibility is that double sets of care for their loved ones, and it's maybe those things that they take up rather than something that is they actively decide to do. And that there's lots of challenges behind that. So what intervention do you think could help young adult carers into employment, education, training? And Kirsty started off. I don't know if anybody else on the panel wanted to contribute.
Identification to begin with. So within the schools is really important. We run a big programme with the Children's Society. The National Lottery's just given us £5 million to roll that out across England and then work in Scotland and Wales as well. But still, I think 62% of schools are saying they've got no young carers on roll. But then the data sort of falls apart when you get to the FE level, etc. But thankfully, we've got the longitudinal study, so we can actually track more and look statistically at what's happening in relation to that. So more data is really important. But then, as mentioned, it's the DWP's employment support systems, it's the youth guarantee within that. I really think apprenticeships, the government wanted to put more emphasis onto vocational pathways. And young adult carers, by and large, they will stay close to home rather than wanting to go away to university. And interestingly, they'll also want to go into health and social care careers because that's what they've seen. And we need more people in health and social care, but isn't it a shame that they haven't got the wider world? More role models. I was a young carer and look what I'm doing now. So there's a whole host of different things we can do. But a big part of what we're doing is just making young carers famous. Get them into the public sight because they've been hidden for a long time.
Thank you. Anybody else want to contribute?
Just to add to that on the data, we do currently have a project looking at younger carers, as you said, in schools, where we've been able to link with National Pupil Database outcomes. And we do see those even at the end of Key Stage 2, we start to see those educational differences opening up. And certainly by the time they get to GCSE and A-level, really dramatic differences. So yeah, early identification.
On the 21-hour rule, it does look like DWP and DFE, they've got a bit of a Mexican standoff. They don't, it's a case of who takes control, who takes charge, and that just seems a bit stuck.
I mean, the hope that the skills has come into the responsibility of DWP, there may be an opportunity for us to look at that as a further point. It was raised very, I think Kirsty, you mentioned it, is the carer support payment in Scotland. and it seems to be less prohibitive in terms of education-related criteria and carers allowance.
Yes.
So do we have any kind of understanding what the impact has been on young adult carers? Does it feel too soon yet?
Anecdotal. I haven't got sort of strong statistics, but we run the Young Carer Services Alliance across Scotland, and the frontline staff are saying that the young people have really welcomed this. You know, it is changing the way they're thinking about their choices. There's a couple of things in Scotland. There's actually a young carer grant, which is for 16 to 19-year-olds. It's £405 per annum, and they can use that for personal things like driving lessons or something like that. But then, in terms of the 21-hour rule, of course, it's not just young adult carers that benefit. It's also older people who might want to retrain, and so it's a wider investment in the skills and economic well-being of carers, I think.
Thank you. So I've just got a few stats of the carer support payment to full-time students. They've thought there's about 30,000 students at college or university in Scotland who provide unpaid care, and then the extension of the carer support payment is approximately 1,500. So it's only 5% of that cohort. So, it's potentially very transportable to England and Wales.
Thank you very much. That concludes this oral evidence session on carers' benefits beyond the Sayce review. Can I thank you for your excellent contributions? Order, order.